Hey everyone, welcome. Today we dive into the most jaw-dropping Reddit stories. Today's topic is all about the almost unbelievable, those insane moments that sound too wild to be true but actually happened. From crazy coincidences to mind-boggling twists, these stories will leave you questioning reality. So buckle up, because you're in for some shocking tales that'll have you saying, "No way that happened." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more unbelievable stories every week. My grandmother was murdered by my grandfather when my mom was a little girl. It was never proven, but we know it. Backstory available if anyone is interested. Side note, the house she died in was also supposedly haunted, a couple of stories there too. Edit, sorry I took so long to reply, guys. I have a 16-month-old, so my computer time is quite limited, haha. Okay, story time. When my mother was 11 she was at home with my nurse grandmother and abusive grandfather. My mom had a pretty tough childhood, and still wet the bed every night. She had 2 older siblings, but they were all moved out and stuff. Anyway, my grandmother was a nurse as I said before. She gave herself a vitamin shot every day. She just administered it to herself, no big deal. She had been doing this as long as my mother can remember. Well, on this particular night, there was a lot of fighting. Threats, crying, physical violence, the whole 9 yards. As my mother is going to bed, her father stops her and offers her a glass of Coke. Of course she says yes, without wondering why an adult would offer a notorious bedwetter a drink at bedtime. The next morning my mother wakes up to her 22-year-old sister shaking her and screaming for her to wake up. My mom woke up but said she felt dizzy and sick. She didn't quite understand why her sister was there, and why she was screaming. Apparently, the night before, about an hour after my mother went to bed, my grandmother gave herself a fatal overdose of insulin. She only kept the insulin in case of emergency for my uncle. My aunt saw the body and said she had bruises and the injection spot had multiple pricks. This was back in the 70s, and after telling the police his wife was a heavy drinker and suicidal, they dropped the case. After my grandmother's death, my grandfather literally just packed up and left. Without his 11-year-old daughter. My mom ended up growing up in group homes and has some terrible stories from her youth. She actually ended up turning into an alcoholic to reclaim her youth, and that killed her 2 years ago on her 46th birthday. Nobody in my family has spoken to him since the 70s. He may have approached my mother in the 90s, she wasn't sure, but he took off after making a racial slur about her biracial children. Even if he was around, he would not be in my life. Okay then, ghost story time. The first one was right after my grandmother died, in the same house. My aunt moved in after my grandfather left to try to take care of my mother. It didn't work out, but that's beside the point. Anyway, my mom gets home from school one day and my aunt is sitting on the driveway, pale and shaking. My mom asked what was wrong and she said she refused to go in. She said she heard something weird in their mother's room. They didn't really go in there, Grandma liked her personal space in life, out of habit, except to occasionally clean. So, my mother approached the door, wondering why her sister was being an idiot. As soon as she touched the doorknob the entire door shook like someone slammed into it. This was accompanied by an almost comical roar. My mom immediately opened the door because she didn't believe it was anything but an idiot dog. Not a thing in the room, and nothing was out of place. My mom said she was more curious to its origins than scared. Same house, same time frame. My mother was in her own bedroom, doing whatever by the window. She happens to glance out her window at her mother's. Their windows faced each other over the backyard patio. She just sees the heavy velvet drapes in the room swishing back and forth really hard, like someone was swinging them. She ran to her mother's room, and the curtains weren't even fluttering. This last thing I'm not sure how factual it is. I've never actually researched it, but it's common knowledge in my family. After my mother moved out of the house into a group home, the house was sold to a newlywed couple. A few months after they moved in, the dude went nuts and chopped his wife into multiple pieces. He then dumped those pieces in the mountains and tried to pretend she never existed. My family likes to use this as proof that something evil was in the house. Holy wall of text. Sorry about the horrendous writing, I hope I got my point across okay. Story 2. Just after I turned 19, I was arrested and charged for an armed robbery I was completely innocent of. I spent 10 months in jail, 6 of which I spent in solitary confinement on suicide watch. I spent my birthday at a resort hotel with my girlfriend at the time. That night at around 3 a.m. the front desk was robbed by 2 people, one with a gun and one with a knife. We were questioned when we left the hotel at 11 a.m., since we roughly matched a height/weight description of the masked robbers. Later that day, it was discovered that my girlfriend had used a bad credit card to pay for the room, unbeknownst to me, and we were both publicly arrested on a sidewalk and taken to the state police barracks in handcuffs, without a word on what we were being charged with. We were taken to separate rooms and questioned for hours on end about the robbery, the same questions over and over again. She ended up going to jail for the credit card and I was released but told to return the next day for further questioning. I did, and was taken to a back room, sat in a corner and had 2 detectives relentlessly question me, picking apart everything I was saying, looking for any circumstantial evidence that could connect me to the crime, and suggesting to me that my girlfriend had robbed the place and I was going down with her if I didn't give them information. Being 19, I had no idea what to do and believed what they were telling me. I didn't question the falsified information they presented to me, and I was brought several times to the brink of giving a confession after being threatened with 10 years upstate if I didn't cooperate. 10 days later, 2 officers showed up at my door and arrested me for armed robbery. My girlfriend was coerced into giving a confession implicating me as an accomplice. I was placed immediately into solitary on 24-hour suicide watch and anxiously waited for a public defender. A week later she showed up and I told her I was totally innocent. She rolled her eyes and said, "Are you kidding me?" I burst into tears, my last hope of release being dashed, and she realized I was telling the truth. She said there's no defense against my girlfriend's confession, and I sank into such a deep depression coupled with shock that I had a psychotic break a few months into my stay. 90 days in solitary at 19 with no hope of proving your innocence will do that. The district attorney made periodic visits to me, offering 2 to 5 year deals for a confession and 10 years if I fought the charges, but I told him I would not admit to something I didn't do. Fast forward to 6 months after my arrest, all spent in solitary. I was woken and driven hurriedly early one morning to the state police barracks, where the DA met with me in a back room and said, "We have determined through further investigation that you were not at the scene of the crime." I was bursting with anger inside and said, "So you'll be releasing me today and dropping all charges, correct?" He got nervous and said, "No. We can't let you go without charges because it would look very bad on us, but I'll tell you what. We'll drop all the charges and give you a charge of interfering with the investigation. You'll be out in less than 6 months." I told him to get my lawyer there. I had a fairly heated exchange, my first real emotions I had felt other than despair in half a year, and agreed. I plead guilty to aiding and abetting the consummation of a crime after the fact and ended up doing 10 months total. A few months after my release, my girlfriend was released and we tried piecing together what happened. Out of nowhere, the mother of the man who planned and committed the robbery found us and told us in person that her son admitted to her that he robbed the place with a close friend of his. He had been fired from the resort 3 days earlier and needed money to support his drug habit. He knew what day would profit most, where the money was, and how to easily get it, as well as how to bypass all form of security. She went to the police and they turned her away, saying they already had the people who did it and they didn't want to hear it. We tried hard to find a lawyer to take our case but were never successful. This DA was later investigated for intimidation and abuse of power in a separate case, and to this day that is my only sense of justice in this situation. Edit, Reddit Gold? Thank you so much. These comments of support and encouragement mean so much to me. Honestly, I can't tell you enough how grateful I am for your sympathy and kindness. Thank you all so much. Every comment has helped me and some of you have even brought me to tears. Again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Story 3. When I was 4, 1992 to 1993, my mom, dad, sister, brother, and I were on our way back from South Dakota. We couldn't find a hotel the night before, so we slept in our Aerostar minivan. My parents did not get a ton of sleep because of this, and so the next day my mom was driving on the interstate and began to fall asleep at the wheel. She crossed over the rumble strips to the left of the road, woke up and overcompensated to the right, and the minivan turned sideways and began to flip and roll at 65 miles per hour. Right before this happened, my siblings and I had gotten permission to switch seats so my dad could read to me from the passenger seat while I sat in the middle row behind him, and we had all not yet buckled up again. During the flipping and rolling, the back seat ended up flying out the back of the van somehow, with my brother and sister going with it. I remember things leading up to this but don't remember anything during the crash. Apparently, I somehow fell into my dad's lap in the front passenger seat, where he held me until the van came to a stop. The van stopped upside down on the road. Both my parents were still buckled in, and my dad was holding me while he was upside down. He unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of the van and left me with a woman that had stopped to help. He then went back to the van to get my mom, who was still buckled in. She is paraplegic, so she needed help out. He looked for my brother and sister while helping her, but they were nowhere to be found. He got my mom out of the van and was helping her off the road when she looked around and didn't see my brother or sister. She began to freak out and ask, "Where are they?" At that moment my dad looked down the road to see my brother and sister walking towards us. They had landed on the side of the road. My brother had just a scrape on his nose and some bruises as he landed in the grass. My sister was not so lucky. She landed on the road and got some major road rash on her arm and shoulder. She was also apparently the one to go through the glass, as she had lots of glass in her wounds. My mom, my dad, and I escaped with some minor scrapes and bruises. We were all rushed to the hospital and everyone turned out okay. My sister got the worst of it, and I can still remember her screaming as they pulled the glass out of her wounds. She also had to have surgery on her arm as a few tendons in her wrist were torn. Overall, we were all extremely lucky to survive. We speculate that if my brother and sister had been in their seatbelts, it may have actually been worse, since they would have been strapped to the rear seat that went flying out the back. I've told this story to friends and had to have my parents confirm it and have my sister show them the scars to get them to believe me. Edit: a few people have asked how my mom can drive. As I said below, there's varying degrees of paraplegic. She has very limited use of her legs, but it's enough to drive. She is also able to walk slowly using a crutch.